today we are on today's daf is 27. We're at the bottom of 26b, 2 lines from the bottom. So we're in the middle of discussing clearance space for a tree at the edge of a field. And Ula had said that Ula said, if the tree is 16 amos, within 16 amos of the border of the field, then you're considered a thief, and you can't bring bikurim because it's not artzacha, it's not your land. In other words, your tree is drawing nutrition from the soil from across the border. Now, so we wanted to know, where does Ula get this from? And so we went through one thing yesterday, and now we have another proposal today. Maybe it's from this brisa, this Mishnah. If you have 3 trees belong to 3 people, and they're planted within one base sa'ah, which is 2,500 square amos, 50 by 50. They can, that's an orchard, right? That becomes an orchard, and what's the difference? And if it's a fruit orchard, then you can plow it the entire base until Shavuos of the year before Shemitah. Okay, so this only makes sense if you think that this Mishnah holds that these 3 trees are they're drawing their nourishment from the whole field. Okay, so because of these 3 trees, the whole field is considered nourishing the trees, and therefore it's not such a Shemitah problem. So now let's figure out from this how much clearance space you need for the tree. Kama havalu, how much space, what's the area of this base saw? Trei alfe v'chamesh meos garmide, 2,500 square amos. So because it's 50 by 50, right? So how do you figure out how much of that of each tree is taking up or drawing its nourishment from? 1/3 of 2,500. Tamne mea utlasin utlas of a tilsa, 833 1/3 square amos, right? So okay, so the Gemara says Akasin Nefisha Ula, but that's Ula is still bigger, because what did Ula say? 16 amos each direction for each tree, right? So that's 32 amos square, which is, what's 32 times 32? Is 1,024.
16
right?
times 16.
No, 16 each direction. Right? Like if you're saying that the tree is here and it's 16 amos away from the border, right? That means it's also drawing from each other direction, right? Right? We're only concerned with the space from the tree to the border, but if you're talking about what, the tree's roots spread in all directions, right? So if it's 16 amos spreads that way, and 16 amos spreads the other way also. So you're 16 by 16, which is 1,024. But that's significantly more than 833 1/3, right? So what's going on here? So Gemara says, "Lo duck." He's not being so precise.
16?
I'm sorry.
16 times 16.
No, 32 times 32. Because if the tree is planted 16 amos away from the edge, right? That means so we're saying that then it's okay. So that means that the tree's roots go out 16 amos from the tree. But you have to figure that happens in each direction, right? Now, in the case of the border, we're only concerned how much space from the tree to the border. But if we say the roots go 16 amos out that way, the roots also go 16 amos out in each other direction. So 16 plus, so the 16 is the radius, not well, it's not, we're considering a square right now, so it's not the radius, but it's half the side, not the whole side of the square. You get it?
Uh-huh.
So therefore it's 32 squared, which is 1,024, right? Which is more than 833. So Gemara says, "Lo dak." Maybe he's just not being precise. Gemara says, "Well, what do you mean not precise?" Amr, I mean lo dak l'chumra. When can you say he's not being precise? When it results in the chumra, where you're saying, yeah, something should be 15 amos, we'll call it 16 amos. Right, but you wouldn't say that to make it smaller, because people are going to attach onto that. If something really should be what should be 16 amos, and you say, oh, it's really 15 amos, right? Or we'll call it 15 amos. Then people will take the 15 amos as the minimum, not 16, right? Lukula, Dakmi, Marina, do we do that for a kula? No, we don't. So where it says misavras baribua coming away, you think we're talking about a square, but think about it. When the tree's roots reach out, it's not reaching out in a square, like it reaching out to the north and to the west, 16 amos, right? Um, so if you want to figure out where the tree's roots, what the tree's roots occupy, you would draw a circle around it from the center, not a square, right? Now bigula coming in, we're talking about a circle. So the area of a circle is actually much closer and a little bit less than what Ula said. Michte, let's figure it out. Kama meruba yosher equal. How much bigger is the area of a square than a circle? Rivia, about a quarter, right? So, right, you can figure this out mathematically. Of course, it doesn't come to exactly a quarter, but if you have a circle within the square, then the radius of the circle is r, the side of the square is 2r, right? The area of the circle is pi r squared. The area of which is like close to 3r squared, right? The area of the square is 4r squared, 2r times 2r, right? So the difference between the area of the circle and the area of the square is approximately 4 to 3, or 1/3 bigger, right? No, the Gemara says here 1/4 bigger. R squared, that's not quite right. You could look at it the other way. If the circle is 1/4 smaller, right? 3 to 4. So Pashalahu Zayin Mei Vashitin Tamanya. So what's the difference? So then the area covered by the circle of 16 amos radius is actually less than 833 that we said before. It's actually 768 roughly. Okay, so 768 is actually much closer to to 830, and it's also less than 830. So you could say that Ula is being approximate. Yes, the Gemara is assuming the pi equals 3, as Charles points out, and that's a well-known phenomenon. It never really bothered me that much. So it's approximating, right? We're not trying to come up with exact numbers. We're trying to establish some broad rules, right? And to compare one number to another. So if I say something is, a ratio of 4 to 3 rather than 4 to 3.1, really, does that make such a difference? And I know a lot of people make a big fuss about whether the Gemara was aware of the dimensions of pi. I mean, look, anybody who's measuring things agriculturally, I mean, you could say that they're all just doing this academically, but it does seem like the Mishnah, at least, was very concerned with reality, right? With to a certain degree. I mean, some things they kind of assume and make up, but it seems like they did have a good knowledge and understanding of the practical realities of farming, right? So to say that, to me, it seems like to say that the Gemara is trying to do a mathematical treatise here and not to try to establish some ground rules, or pardon the pun, for how to how to establish people's rights in certain situations. This seems a little pedantic. But you are correct, Charles, that the Gemara does seem to assume that pi is 3. And I think it's fine that they're approximating. In fact, the whole context of this is approximation, right? Okay, so
what's the
Gemara says,
point here what is the point then when we have 768 versus 833? I mean, I
so
understand
now,
the math, but isn't that less than what he would have said before?
yes, it is, and that's what we're trying to get to, because we're trying to say maybe Ula's not being precise. So before he said what? He's not being precise by l'chumra. That doesn't make sense. But now he's being not precise l'kula, because he's saying it's really less. The 768 is less than 833. So that means l'kula, right? That means like we're I'm sorry, I'm saying backwards. Now it's l'chumra, right? Now it's like when he gives his imprecise number, if you actually use that imprecise number as the guideline, you would end up being more machmir, not less machmir. So that's okay. And also, by the way, the number is a lot closer to the actual number if he's estimating than we had before.
Well, the actual
So
number was what? Was 1024?
the actual number is 833. Um, no, 1 second. Yeah, the actual number we're dealing that from we see from the Mishnah of the three trees is 833, right? Before we thought that Ul was approximating to 1024. Now we're saying no, because we're using the circle instead of the square. He's approximating to keep forgetting the number, 760 something. What was it?
68.
768. And so where it says Akasi Pashle Palga Diamsa, there's still like uh so the according to the Mishnah, the tree is getting its nourishment from 833 amos, which is 16 and a half amma circle, right? And now he's saying 16. So I do duck. The Gemara says exactly. That's why we're saying he's not being precise. When he says 16 amos, it's around 16 amos. 16 and a half is the real measurement. Well, chumrah lo duck. And it's being more stringent, right? More machmir, because according to the Mishnah, um, uh, you're off the hook for bikurim with 16 and a half amma radius circle or space from the border, I should say. And Ula said like 16. Okay. So in other words, the mistake you could make by following Ula would be that you would bring more bikurim, not less bikurim. Okay, like you would bring bikurim even though you're not really required to. So that's l'chumra, and therefore he can be imprecise.
But
But
Ula's
really,
amount
but
was
really the number
1024.
is, I'm sorry.
Wasn't Ula's amount 1024?
Yeah, but now 1024 was figured out by the square of 16 plus 16,
Right.
right? Okay, now we're saying no, it's a circle of 16 amos, not a square of radius 16 amos. It's a circle with radius 16 amos, right? And that comes out to be actually from the other from the Mishnah of the three trees. It turns out that the real area it should be that covered by the tree is a radius of 16 and a half. So when Ula says 16, he's not being quite so precise, but it's okay that he's not being so precise, because what's the result of following Ula would be you'd be more machmir, you'd bring more bikurim, right? You'd bring bikurim even from a tree that's 16 amos away, and not just 16 and a half amos away.
So 16 and a half would be even a larger area, right? 16 and a
Right.
half.
So 16 and a half. So it comes out according to this is 16 and a half is the real rule, right? In other words, a circle of that accords with the other Mishnah, which is a circle of radius 16 and a half amos, or a total of 833 and a third square amos. Right.
Well, no. If it was
So
16
really
and a
the
half, it would be
distance,
1089, wouldn't it? If it was
no,
16 and a
16.
half radius as a square, it would be even greater. It would be
Right,
1089.
but now, no, but we already said we're not doing squares
Right.
anymore. That doesn't make sense, right? You have to do circles. So if the radius is 16 and a half, it comes out to 833, which is a third of the, see, I think what you're mixing up here is there's two separate applications here. In the case of the tree with the roots reaching out, you have to consider a circle. That makes sense, right? Because like where do the roots, how far do the roots go from the base of the tree in any direction? That defines a circle, right? But the case of the three trees in the orchard, like how much of this that could be a square orchard, or it could be any shape. But the point is that three trees cover 2,500 square amos, which means each tree covers 833 square amos, which comes out to a circle whose radius is 16 and a half amos. Now, I know. So it's like it's going to be hard to find exactly like where are these trees in the field and what is the shape of the field. That really doesn't make a lot of sense. Do you have a field that is composed of three concentric circles? I don't think so. Nobody has a field of that shape. So you could kind of go deeper into this and say, well, what kind of field is the Gemara talking about, and how do the roots branch out of the tree, and what shape and what direction? Um, so that's actually, I think, a very valid question, but the Gemara doesn't go there. The Gemara just takes as a given the Mishnah statement that 3 trees cover 2,500 square amos, period. Okay, and then if that were in a circle, that would be a circle of six for each tree of 16 and a half amos. And now Ula is saying, what about how far does your now let's so never mind. So we've established that one fact, okay, or that one baseline, that a tree covers an area of a circle defined by a radius of 16 and a half amos. Okay, now apply that to the case of the tree with the planted along the border of the neighbor's field. Okay, so now we're not interested in square or circle anymore. We're interested in what is the shortest distance from the base of the tree to the border, right? And Ula said 16 amos is what is how it needs to be at least 16 amos away, right? Where the Gemara is saying, you know what, really he means 16 and a half amos, and that would make it accord with the Mishnah of the how much space does a tree take up.
I just don't know
If
how
that
you get
makes
to
sense.
16 and a half. Where does that come from?
16 and a half is the radius of a circle whose area is 833. So if you got a calculator on you, if the radius is 16,
16 and a half,
16 and a half,
you
it was
square
16
that,
and a half
right?
squared.
16 is 16 and a half squared is 816 plus something. And
No, 16 and a half squared? No, that doesn't sound right. Times 3.
right, but times
Yeah,
3, right. Okay.
yes. Is how much?
Half times 16.5 times 3 is 816 and 3/4.
It's 16 and 3/4. Let me see if I get the same. Second. Calc.
So you say that's approximate. So I guess if it's pi, that's if times 3. So pi at 3.1 is maybe it's 833. Okay, whatever. Depends.
16 here, right? Right. Times 3.14. Yeah, actually, if you use the proper value of pi, then you get close to 866. 868. I get 854.
But the value is 833.
Okay, well, 16 and a half isn't exact either then. Like
Oh,
nobody said 16 and a half, right? We're just saying what is the area covered by, what is the radius of a circle covered by 800 and a circle whose area is 868 is about 16 and a half. It's actually more like,
no, we
no, is
have
it seven?
768, right? It was 833 and then 768.
Second, 867. It's actually 17 comes out more. I don't know why 16 and a half. Six. Hmm. Okay, there's a long note here with Rashi. Um, Apparently there's another version, another Girsa of this, which is 16 and 2/3, which is a little closer. These are all good questions. The math doesn't come out quite right. You're correct. However, the point is whatever the actual radius is of a circle whose area is 800 and
33?
no
833? You got 833.
868.
No, that was
No,
768.
768. Yeah. Um, um, of 833 is So 768. Yeah, 768 is actually closer, right? It's do that one more time. 16.5, 16.5 times 3 is 816. So it's not quite. I mean, whichever way you work it, it's not quite accurate. But the Gemara's point is, it's it's a little more than 16. Call it 16 and a half. We're approximating after all. And when Ula says 16, the main point is that he's approximating, right? Really, it's more than 16. It's 16 point something.
For
Okay.
what's the final value? The
Of
833 and 833 and a third?
the final value of.
Whatever. I mean, we're doing based on 768 or 833.
Okay, so the final, so Ula is saying you have to plant your tree 16 amos away from the border, right? How does he get that? Because the Mishnah of the three trees teaches us that each tree occupies, or its roots occupy, an area that's a little more than 16 amos radius. Okay, and that's how Ula gets the idea that about 16 amos is how far you have to be from your neighbor's field when you plant your tree, because the radius of the roots that the tree will occupy is about 16, a little more than 16. That's what he's saying, approximately 16.
Right. With the value of 768, then if we use that 768, then 16 is exactly 768. 16 squared times 3 is 768.
Uh-huh.
Then it's exactly 16. But
Okay.
so I'm getting confused between the 768 and the 833. I don't-
1 second.
So I mean, if it's the 768, then 16 would be exactly the number, and then he would be precise at 16.
Mm-hmm. Right, because the Mishnah was clear that it's 833,
So it's a little more
right?
than 16.
Right. And that's what Ula is saying, is around 16, a little more than 16, but he just said 16, and we're understanding that as being an approximate value. Okay, and that's the difference between the circle of 833 and the circle of 768, is just a small amount of difference in the radius. Okay, so Tashna, let's okay, so now we're going to try to we're just now we're going to discuss whether Ula's view is correct. So Ula said around 16 amos is how far you have to be from your neighbor, and if you're not that far, then the tree doesn't. You can't bring bikurim from the tree, right? So let's see if that's correct. Tashma, hakona ilan v'karkao maybe v'kare. If you buy a tree and the land around it, then you have that's chayven bikurim. You have to bring bikurim, and you read. When you bring bikurim, part of the procedure is you read Arami Oved Avi, right? So Gemara says, "My love kol shehu." Like, okay, when you say that you buy the tree and the land around it, does that mean like the full 16 point whatever amos? It sounds like you're just buying the tree and a little bit of land around it. So if that's the case, then then Ula is incorrect. Right? So Gemara says, look, Yudvav Amma. No, what it's talking about is the 16 Ammas that we're talking about, exactly like Ula. Tashma, we have try to prove it another way. If you buy, so your friend has a field, and you're buying two trees within that field. Maybe you bring bikurim, l'chumra, but you don't read the parsha l'kul. Shlosha maybe bikare. So you said two trees, right? So if you buy three trees together within your neighbor's field, then you do the full bikurim ritual. My love kol shehu. So doesn't that mean that you're buying a little bit of land around each tree? Again, it's not a very good assumption. Where it says lo hachanami yudvavama, we're talking about 16 amas. So I'm not even sure what the question was originally. Tashma, Rabbi Akiva Omer, karka kol shehu. even a small amount of land, chayav b'peo bikurim. If you have a field that's very small, you still have to, you're responsible for leaving the corner for the poor and for bikurim, because you know a pruzbul. It's also enough to write a pruzbul. You know, a pruzbul, if you attach your loan to land, then you can collect it after Shemitah. And you can also, when you acquire property, you can at the same time acquire metaltalim as part of the same deal, movable objects. So, in other words, even a very small field qualifies for all these things, including bikurim.
So
So
it's not 16 by 16 then, or 32 by.
exactly, right? So and here we're saying specifically a minute amount of land, right? So Gemara says, what are we talking about? We're talking not about a tree, we're talking about a wheat field, right? So wheat doesn't have the same issue with the roots. The wheat presumably just draws its nourishment from the immediate area, whereas a tree, we know that the roots spread out. So this Mishnah is talking about a wheat field, not a fruit orchard. Dekaname, and we can also read that into the Mishnah, Diktani Kolshu, because it says it's very small. You can't have an orchard like a tree. If you have a mature tree, that's more than a kolshu, right? The tree itself has a significant area. And you wouldn't refer to it as a kolshu. So shmamina, so we're talking about a very small wheat field. Toshma, we have another attempt to discuss the 16 amma thing. Elon misaso ba'aretz misaso chutz. You have a tree that's half in Eretz Yisrael and half in chutz la'aretz. It's on the border. Tevel v'chulin muravin zeh b'zeh. So the fruit is like at the same time it's mixed up together. It's tevel, meaning some of the fruit draws its nourishment from Eretz Yisrael, and so until you take truma and maser from it, it's tevel and v'chulin, and it's also half of part of each fruit draws its nourishment from chutz la'aretz, and so it has no requirement for truma and maser. It's chulin. So each piece of fruit is part tevel and part chulin. Divrei Rabbi. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer Hagadol b'chiyuv chayav. The fruit growing in the airspace of Eretz Yisrael is required to have truma maser. Hagadol p'tur. The fruit growing in the airspace of chutz la'aretz is not required to have truma maser taken from it. So Adkan lo plige ella demar sar yesh breira umar savar ein breira. Now, what are they arguing about? They're arguing about retroactive determination of what the reality is, right? So according to Rosh Gamliel, you split the space along the border and you determine like this fruit is all getting its nourishment from chutz la'aretz, and then the fruit on the other side is getting its nourishment from Eretz Yisrael. Avagadol b'ptur divrei kol p'tur patur. But what about the whole tree is growing outside of Eretz Yisrael? Then everybody would say that the fruit is off the hook, right? It's not high, but what if it's on the border? Don't the roots go into Eretz Yisrael?
Just review the concept of breira.
Yeah, I don't quite see how Breira has to what Breira has to do with it, to be honest with you. Breira is usually a retroactive determination, and here it's more like we're determining from the reality that this fruit is growing on this side. We assume that the nourishment is coming from that side as well. So I don't quite see how it's really Breira. This is, sometimes the case with Breira. It doesn't really seem to strictly follow the idea of retroactivity. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, I have a hard time seeing of how this is really a retroactive determination, unless someone has any thoughts on that to convince me otherwise. Anybody?
Every time I hear breira, I have to really think what it means in that context, and I didn't really understand it here in this case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer the question because I really agree with you. It's not really retroactive. It is just kind of determining the reality or making assumptions about the reality. So I don't really have an answer to your question other than to say maybe I don't really understand Brera well enough. But if it really means retroactivity, then it's not being used precisely here. But the point is that everybody would agree that if the tree trunk is located in Chutz La'aretz, even if it's right on the edge of the border, then all the fruit is considered Chutz La'aretz fruit, right? But what about the 16 amos rule, right? If Ula is correct that the tree draws nourishment from 16 amos away, so wouldn't you also say that the same machlokas would apply? And if you say that the fruit growing in the airspace of Eretz Yisrael draws its nourishment from Eretz Yisrael, you would say the same thing here, right? But the implication from the machlokas here is that if the tree trunk itself is outside of Eretz Yisrael, none of these considerations apply, right? So this appears to contradict Ula. Our answer is Hachamayaskinon b'mafsik tsunma. You know what? There's a rock along the border, underground. Okay, so the tree is kind of split. Everything from the rock towards Chutz La'aretz is Chutz La'aretz. Everything from the rock towards Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Yisrael, and the nourishment from each side stays on that side. Okay, because of this rock in the middle. So in that case, if the tree was on the border but outside of the border of Eretz Yisrael, and there was a rock that kept the roots from growing into Eretz Yisrael, then yeah, you would say indeed it's all Chutz La'aretz because the rock um, keeps the roots from intruding into Eretz Yisrael. So whereas you see Hache, my Talmud Rabbi, okay, well if that's the case, why would Rabbi say differently, right? If we're talking about a case where the roots are all in Chutz La'aretz, why would Rabbi say that the fruit on the Eretz Yisrael side, like it should be considered like two trees? Where it says the Hadre Arve, um, because according to Rabbi, sure, the nutrients get drawn from different areas of the soil, but then they get into the trunk and they all mix together before they get to the fruit. So each fruit is actually getting, even when there's a rock, is getting mixed nutrients.
So then
But
it's half and half,
okay?
right?
I'm sorry?
But then it would be half and half. So if it's all mixed up, you don't know
Right.
which
So
part comes from Chutz La'aretz and which
right.
is
So
from
Rabbi says
Eretz Yisrael.
each fruit is half and half. Yeah. Because the nutrients all get mixed together. So each fruit you can't separate. Um, yeah, maybe this is the retroactivity again. It's not really retroactive, but you can't split that reality. Okay, so what is the actual argument? Marsavar Avira Mevalbel. Rebbe says that the um that the trunk
The air.
yeah, the air really, but I think he means things that happen above the ground that mixes together everything that comes from the soil. And the other holds that no, the path of the nutrients goes directly from wherever the root is into the fruit, right? They don't get mixed together. Okay, so you could argue about that. It seems unlikely. So now Vishesha Srayama Vitulo. So Ula says it has to be 16 amos. Is really only 16 amos, so it's none. We have another Mishnah. Marchikin Sa'ilam Minabar Kafei Ama. Another Mishnah says if you have a tree near your neighbor's pit, right, and you don't want the roots, or he doesn't want the roots to intrude into his pit, then you have to keep your tree 25 amos away, not 16 amos away. Amrabai Mezel Tuva Asli. Yeah, really, the roots travel 25 amos from the tree. But the furthest reaching roots, they're not really doing a great job of drawing nutrition to the tree. The main nutrition of the tree comes from the first 16 amos, right? So when you're talking about bikurim and where does this tree get its nutrition from, that's only 16 amos away from the trunk. When you're talking about tree roots intruding into somebody else's pit, Well, those roots actually go out 25 amos. That's why you have a different ruling. But more than 16 amos, we're not really drawing nutrition from the earth. It's mostly from the 16 amos.
So wait, well,
Yes.
going back 1 second, going back with this Machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, so if they hold that it becomes mixed in the tree, is each party on either side chayav in bikurim then? Because they don't know which one.
Good question. Who brings bikurim? Well, we were talking about a tree that's less than 16 amos away from the border, right?
Oh, well, part of it is in Chutz La'aretz, so then they wouldn't be chayav in bikurim then, right?
Right.
Only the
Right,
people.
and then that could be the same owner, right? That could be the one owner of the tree, but part of it is Chutz La'aretz, part of it is Eretz Yisrael. So then you know who's supposed to bring the bikurim if it is chayav and bikurim. That's the guy who owns the tree.
But does he have?
We didn't have that case doesn't need two owners. That case could be one owner. Yeah.
So then he still would bring bikurim because it's still some of it grew in Eretz Israel.
Well, that's what they're arguing about. Yeah. Like, do you say the parts that the fruit that's in the airspace of Chutz La'aretz is free from bikurim, or do you say no? Every fruit draws its nourishment partly from Eretz Yisrael. Kiyos Rav Dimi Amar. When Rav Dimi came to Bavel, he said, "Bami ne Reish Lakish Rav Yochanan." But Reish Lakish asked Rav Yochanan, "Ilan Samach Lameitzer b'toch Yud Vav Amamau, a tree near the border, 16 amos away. What about it? What about bikurim? Amarle Gazlan Huvein Mevim Mimenu bikurim. No, you're illegally drawing sustenance from your neighbor's field, and no bikurim because it's not me'artzacha." Kiyasa Ravin on Rabbi Yochanan, when Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Echad Ilan Hasamuch L'Meitzer, Echad Ilan Hanota, whether it's a tree that's near the border, or if it's a tree that the branches are extending over the border, maybe you do bring bikurim and you do it with the full recitation. Shalmanas Kain Hinchu Yeshua Yisrael Sards, because you know why? This is a good way to resolve everything. This is one of the conditions that more often refers to, I think, 10 conditions that under which Yoshua divided up the land. He said, I'm giving you this field and you this field, this portion and you this portion, but you should know that when it comes to bikurim, it's okay if you have the tree here, or it's not okay if you have the tree here, right? Everything was kind of predetermined as a condition. So that's how you know how to behave in these circumstances. Next Mishnah. You have a tree whose branches go into your neighbor's field. So you can trim the branches, the lower branches, to allow a plow. So if you have a plow, apparently you have the plow is a certain height off the ground, and above that you have the thing to prod the ox, right? So the standard height of the ox prod, calls it an ox goad here, that's how much your neighbor can trim your branches over his property. If it's a carob tree or a sycamore tree, which has very dense branches, you can cut all the branches that intrude along a plumb line that you suspend over the boundary. So in other words, you can cut off anything in the airspace of your property because it's very dense. So that tree actually affects what's going on the ground on your side of the boundary. Presumably makes a lot of shade. Maybe there's not enough sun for crops to grow. Therefore, you can cut all the branches to let in the sun. Beis Shlachim, if it's a irrigated field, Kol Ha'ilan Keneged Hamashkolos, then also you can cut all the branches along the boundary line. Because presumably an irrigated, so the assumption here is that an irrigated field, you need even more sunlight. I guess more of the field is getting watered or something, and therefore, I don't know, I'm not sure why that is, but that's the rule of the Mishnah. If it's an irrigated field, you can get rid of all the shade. Any branches of a tree that has no leaves, you can definitely cut those, all of those in the airspace of your property as well. Okay, so Gemara says Yibaylahu Abishal Reisha Kai Asefa Kai is Rabbi Abishal when he says that if it's a leafless tree, is he talking about the ox goad measure or or he's talking about an ordinary field or an irrigated field? Gemara says Tashma the Tanya, we have a brisa based on shlachim. If you have an irrigated field, Abishal Omer Kol Yilin Kegan Mashkalas. So it seems quite clear here that Abishal is talking about an irrigated field where you can cut all the branches of the tree in your airspace. Because an irrigated field suffers from having shade. So it's clear. Shmamina, that indeed the Gemara agrees, that's clear. You can also infer that from the language of the Mishnah. Kol Ilan Srak. Bashal says every tree with no leaves. It makes sense if you say that he's talking about Beis Hashlachin Kol Ilan. That's why it says all trees. Because he's arguing with the Tanakama who only specified two kinds of trees that you can cut all the all of the leaves off, right? So the Tanakama says only a carob and a sycamore, and Abishal says no, all trees. And they're both talking about Beis Hashlachin. Avali Amra Sasefekai, but if we're talking about the last case of the Mishnah, Elon struck me by he shouldn't have said Kol Elon, he would have said Elon struck, and he should have just said trees with no leaves, not all trees with no leaves. All implies he's arguing with someone who says only certain trees. Okay. Next Mishnah. What if the tree is hanging over into the public space? So anybody who's coming by, or maybe it's whoever's in charge of the public space, or maybe it means any individual who uses the public space, can trim the tree so that a camel and rider can pass by. Rabbi Hila Omer, Gomel ton pishon chavilis maros. Now it's a camel that's loaded with flax or twigs or whatever. A camel with a load, not a camel with a rider. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kol ha'ilan keneged mishkalos. Rabbi Shimon says you can cut off all of the overhanging tree. That's overhanging Rosh Hashanah mipnei tuma because of a concern of tuma. So we'll see what that means in a minute. But presumably what we're talking about is the overhang of the tree. If there's something tame anywhere under the tree, then the overhang of the tree creates an ohel, and tuma is transmitted to anywhere beneath that tree. And so now if you don't want to become tame, or if you're a kohen or whatever, and you're passing by, what if there's something tame, if there's a dead body under the tree on the private property side, and you don't even see it's there, right? And you don't even know you're becoming tummy because you're under the tree. Therefore, you can cut the canopy of the tree so that is not a problem. So Gemara says, Mantana de Benizaki and Basar Umdana de Hashazlinan. Which Tana says that we so the assumption here is which Tana of our Mishnah holds that when it comes to damages, you only look at the current situation and not a possible future situation. Amarish Lakish, but Machlokas Shnuya. Our Mishnah is subject to a machlokas. Rabbi Eliezer, it's according to Rabbi Eliezer. Ein osin chalal tachas rishus harabim baro shichin uaros. You can't dig a hole underneath the public domain, right? Because you're going to possibly cause it to collapse. Rabbi Eliezer Matir, Rabbi Eliezer says it's okay. If you can dig underneath, if what remains above is strong enough for a wagon full of rocks, so not to collapse it. Now, the problem is that over time, it will continue to weaken, right? So is his assumption here, right? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, you don't worry about what might happen in the future. You worry about the damage you caused right now. If right now you haven't caused enough damage that it will make any difference to anybody because a fully loaded truck is going to be able to still drive over it, then you don't worry about, like a year from now, it won't be able to support that. Whereas the Tanakama would say you do worry about that. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Afilu Chen Rabbanan. Rabbi Yochanan says no. You could even say that the Rabbanan here who say that you can't dig the hole at all. You could even say that accords with our Mishnah. Hasam simnin de mafchis v'lavadate. In the case of the whole underground, like you might not be aware of what's happening. Like people won't know that over time it's deteriorating. They might not even know that it's hollowed out underneath it all, right? So there's a possible future damage there. Kaval kama kakayetzle. In this case, you can keep cutting it. So you cut some now. If it grows back, you keep cutting, right? It's like it's something that can be maintained on an ongoing basis. So therefore, like even if you say we're concerned about future damages, but we don't have to be concerned if you can forestall those future damages in the future. So Rebuta says not a camel with a rider, but a camel that's fully laden. They ask, sure the reason nafish, Odilma sure the Rabbanan nafish. Well, which is a larger takes up more vertical space? Is it the camel with the rider or the camel with the load? Pshita the sure the Rabbanan nafish. So clearly it's the rabbis who say, the Tanakama who said the camel with the rider. If you want to say it's the camel with the load that's higher, what like what would the rabbi say? Like clearly, you should have to allow a camel with a what would the rabbis do when a camel, a fully laden camel with a load comes? What would you do then? So Gemara says, "V'elamai sure the rabbanon nafish." You want to say that the rabbis have that the rider is the larger measure. Rabbi Yehuda b'shir the rabbanon mayavis. So you could ask the same question. Well, what happens? Like, isn't it the case that there are people? Sometimes camels have riders, and sometimes camels have loads, right? So like there must be something else going on here. Gemara answers, Efshar de gachin v'chalif tote. The rider can bend over, right? So the machlokas between Rabban and Rabbi Huda is, does the rider have to, like the rider is higher, but the rider can bend over. So according to the rabbis, he shouldn't have to bend over, and you have to clear a space high enough for a camel with a fully erect rider. According to Rabbi Yehuda, no, you only have to be high enough for the fully laden camel. And if a camel with a rider comes along, the rider can bend over and he'll fit underneath too.
And
Rabbi
that's
Shimon
not
Amar
the
Kol
case with
Hmm?
with a load on there. The load can't bend over. So
Right, exactly. So that's the minimum, according to Rabbi Yehuda.
so Rabbi Yehuda would hold that the rider
Rabbi Yehuda holds that it only has to be as high as the fully loaded camel. And if you ask me, what about when a camel with a rider comes along who's higher? The answer is he bends over. Rabbanan say no, he shouldn't have to bend over. He should cut more branches so that he can
right, okay.
ride erect without having to bother to bend over.
Right, okay.
Okay, Rabbi Shimon Amar Kol Ilan Keneged Mashkolos B'nei Atuma. Rabbi Shimon says you can cut all of the tree in the airspace of Rishus Harabim because of Tuma. What does that mean? Tana Mipnei Ol Atuma. Bryce says the version because of a Tuma, as I described before, Tumas Ohel, right? That if the tree canopy remains intact in Rishus Harabim, it will carry Tuma from anywhere else under the canopy. Shita, so that's obvious. Mibnei Atumatan, like how else could you interpret that? So Gemara says, here's how else you might have interpreted it. Even if the Mishnah has, if we only have the Mishnah which says Mibnei Atuma, Dilma might say Orev Tuma v'Shali Hasam. Maybe what we're talking about is that a bird comes along and drops sherets onto the branches, so it's above you and in the tree canopy, and you walk underneath it, and you unwittingly become tame, right? Visagya b'dachlule ba'alma. So if that would be the case, so you wouldn't really need to remove the entire canopy over Rishus Harabim. You just have to trim it, thin it out, so that wouldn't be a possibility. So there wouldn't be enough branches to catch a big enough piece of Asheretz to carry Tuma, right? So Kamash Malan, so the Bryce will come along and say, no, that's not the problem. The problem is not that a bird might drop sherets on the branches. The problem is Ohel Hatuma, and therefore you remove the entire canopy on the Rishus Harabim side so that there won't be a possible transmission of Tuma to the Rishus Harabim side.
How are you interpreting Sagya v'dechuli ba'alma?
It would be enough to thin out the branches, right? So that there's not enough branches to catch a piece of the piece of sherets, the sherets that's dropped by the bird, right? So if you don't have thick branches, nothing would stick in the tree, right? So in other words, I might have thought the concern is that a bird will drop a sherets, it'll get stuck in the branches, and then anybody passing underneath it will become tame, right? Well, the answer to that would be you don't have to remove the whole canopy. You thin it out so that that's not a possibility, so that any falling sherets would fall all the way to the ground, right? But if the problem is tumas ohel, that you're concerned about the spreading of tuma from one side of the canopy to the other, then you have to remove the entire canopy, because even a thinned out canopy would spread the tuma. So so that proves that the concern here really is, as I described in the first place, that the concern is the canopy spreading the tuma, and therefore you can remove the entire canopy of the tree that is on the Rishus Harabim side, so that there will not be inadvertent transfer of tuma from underneath some other part of the tree.
It's interesting that in this translation, I'm looking at a translation here, he calls the dachule a scarecrow that could frighten away.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, that's a valid translation also, I guess, because if the problem is that a passing bird might drop a sherets, then put a scarecrow there and the birds will stay away and nobody's going to drop any sherets.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's a good one. I didn't see that translation. That's cool. Okay, Hadron Lach Le'achor is the end of this parak, and tomorrow we will begin the third parak, Chas Tabat. See you all then.
A good day.